The cold, damp walls of the Tower of London echoed with the sound of heavy footsteps. In the dim light, a figure moved slowly, his face a mask of fear and determination. George Boleyn, brother of the Queen, had been brought here, accused of crimes so heinous that even the most hardened of men would quiver. The charges were clear: treason and worse, incest with his own sister, Queen Anne. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone, and the weight of impending doom. George knew this was not just about him. It was about the entire Boleyn family, their rise to power, and their looming fall. George's mind raced back to the days when the Boleyns were untouchable. His sister, Anne, had captivated King Henry VIII with her wit, her charm, and her intellect. She had risen from a mere lady in waiting to the most powerful woman in the kingdom, becoming Queen of England. Her ascent was swift, and her influence over the king was undeniable. But Anne's hold on Henry's heart was fragile, and it depended on more than just her beauty and intelligence. It relied on her ability to bear him a son, an heir to secure the Tudor dynasty. When Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, it was a setback, but not a fatal one. The omens of fertility were good, and Anne fell pregnant again early in 1534. The Boleyns were still hopeful. But Anne's role as queen was more than just a matter of bearing children. The conventional view of a wife was that she should be chaste, humble, and obedient. A wife should be pious and silent, and the nagging wife was a figure of ridicule. Anne, however, was a woman with a mind of her own, and she had her own political agenda. She had held Henry's attention for years through her intelligence and her temper. She had steered Henry's policies, led her family's faction, and never hesitated to tell the king what she thought of him, especially when he attempted to stray. Henry found this fascinating, and though their relationship was marked by fiery rows, it was always followed by passionate reconciliation. Observers were baffled by Henry's reactions, but Anne always seemed to know what she was doing. However, what Anne failed to realize was that what was acceptable behavior in a mistress was not acceptable in a wife. Henry, despite his reputation as a man who would do anything to get his way, was conventional in his expectations. He began to find Anne's tantrums and her political interference intolerable. After becoming queen, she should have left the politics to her father and brother, and to Thomas Cromwell. Her piety and the use of her patronage were appropriate, but receiving the French ambassador and briefing the king's envoys were not. Then, in the summer of 1534, Anne miscarried. The loss of the child, whose gender was unknown, was a serious setback. Doubts began to cloud Henry's mind. Had he made another mistake, the court was a place of whispers and rumors. Emissaries from the Spanish court, like Eustace Chapais, the imperial ambassador, alternately rejoiced and lamented the changes in Henry's affections. They quarreled, danced, hunted, and copulated with all the enthusiasm of a couple in love. But when rumors spread that Henry was pursuing another lady at court, Anne reacted badly. The quarrel did not go away so easily. Anne was pregnant again at Christmas 1535, and expectations were high. But the landscape of the court changed dramatically when, in January 1536, Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, died at Kimbolton. The Earl of Wiltshire, Anne's father, was heard to mutter that it was a pity Mary, Catherine's daughter, had not gone the same way. The death of Catherine removed a powerful shield that had long protected Anne. George, Anne's younger brother, had always been a key figure in the Boleyn rise to power. Born around 1504, he was educated in the best humanist tradition, and may have spent time at Oxford as an adolescent. His first appearance at court was at the Christmas revels in 1514, an introduction owed to his parents, who were active courtiers. By 1516, he was a page in the king's chamber, and by 1525 he was a member of the Privy Chamber. His career was marked by a series of appointments and grants, including the manor of Grimston in Norfolk, which he may have taken up when his duties at court permitted. He was knighted in 1529, and his diplomatic missions to France and the Emperor earned him the king's favor. George's marriage to Jane Parker, the daughter of Henry Parker, 10th Baron Mountjoy, in 1526, was likely an arranged match. Jane was a suitable bride, and the king gave them a marriage gift of £20 a year. There were no signs of great affection between them, and they had no children. George may have had other liaisons, and there were rumors of a son born to him in 1529, though the identity of the mother was unknown. Jane was expected to attend upon Anne, and she was in the Queen's entourage during her coronation and lying in. However, by 1534, Jane had fallen out with the Boleyn family and was banished from court. She spent time in the Tower in 1535 and became increasingly suspicious of George's relations with other women, including his sister. Religion also played a role in the growing tension between George and Jane. George was an evangelical, committed to the idea of printing the Bible in English. He translated religious texts into English at Anne's request, and these translations may have contributed to the hostility Jane showed by 1535. Jane was more orthodox in her faith, and had no significant patronage to indicate otherwise. The translations George made, including Lefebvre's Episters et Evangeles and El Ecclesiast, were dedicated to Anne, reflecting the close bond between them. The accusations against George and Anne in May 1536 were the culmination of years of tension and shifting alliances at court. Jane's involvement in the charges against her husband seemed well established. She had carried stories about Anne's infidelities to the king, including tales of a familiarity between the Queen and her brother that went beyond what was appropriate. These stories, which dated back to 1534, were likely used to build the case against George and Anne. Jane, feeling that she owed a debt to Thomas Cromwell, wrote to him shortly after George's arrest, asking for the king to grant her the movable property of her late husband. Her only income was an annuity of 100 marks, settled on her by the Earl of Wiltshire for the term of his life. As George stood in the shadow of the Tower, he knew that his fate and that of his family hung in the balance. The world he had known was about to change, and the Boleyns, once the most powerful family in England, were on the verge of a catastrophic fall. Jane's life took a tumultuous turn after her exclusion from court. Within weeks, she found herself back at court as a lady of the chamber to Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, who married him on May 30th. Jane likely returned to court out of necessity, as the position provided her with a much-needed income. It's uncertain where she stayed when not at court, but she might have been given the use of Grimston, a property that was in the king's hands. After Jane Seymour's death, Jane found herself in a period of uncertainty until she secured a similar position in the household of Anne of Cleves, Henry's fourth wife. This appointment might have been due to Thomas Cromwell's continued favor. During her time with Anne, Jane made a famous remark about it being a long time before we shall see a Duke of York, in response to Anne's description of her wedding night. By this point, Jane was experienced in the ways of the court, especially the bedchamber, which might have led to her being transferred to serve Catherine Howard, Henry's fifth queen. Jane, around 36 at the time, must have seemed like a motherly figure to the young, 19-year-old Catherine. It was during this period that Jane became entangled in Catherine's scandalous affairs. Catherine confided in Jane about her prenuptial adventures, and Jane found herself in a difficult position. She could not resign her post without betraying Catherine's trust, and she may have even felt affection for her wayward mistress. Catherine asked Jane to act as a go-between for her and her lovers, Francis Derryham and Thomas Culpeper. Jane arranged for them to meet in Catherine's chambers during the royal progress to the north, in the summer of 1541. Though Jane did not witness any sexual activity, she believed it was happening. When the scandal came to light, Jane was accused of aiding and abetting the Queen's infidelity, which was considered high treason. Both Catherine and Jane were interrogated, and Catherine broke down in hysterics. The men involved, Derryham and Culpeper, were tried and executed for their roles. Jane and Catherine were condemned by Act of Attainder in January 1542, and executed on February 13th. After her death, Jane was described as a meddlesome female, and that bawd the Lady Jane Rochford. Meanwhile, George Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's brother, continued to rise in favor at court. He was among the few who attended Henry's secret wedding to Anne, although the exact details of the event were disputed. George was summoned to Parliament in February 1533 as Viscount Rochford, a sign that he was expected to support the king in the House of Lords. He voted in favor of the act in restraint of appeals, and was frequently involved in diplomatic missions, including a trip to France to prevent a meeting between Francis and Clement. Despite some setbacks, George remained a key figure in the king's court, serving on important commissions and holding significant positions like Constable of Dover Castle and Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports. George's relationship with Anne, and his support for her evangelical agenda, helped him gain the king's trust. He was granted several manors and served on commissions against the Carthusian priors and Sir Thomas More. However, his favor did not protect him from the sudden and tragic fall of the Boleyn family. On May 2, 1536, George was arrested and taken to the Tower along with his sister Anne. Despite his intelligence and resourcefulness, he was tried and executed on May 19th, leaving behind no lawful children and ending the legitimate Boleyn line. The events leading to the Boleyns' downfall were complex and multifaceted. Anne and Henry's relationship had been strained for some time, with rumors of the king's interest in other women and his growing dissatisfaction with Anne's inability to produce a male heir. The death of Catherine of Aragon in January 1536 removed a significant barrier to Henry's potential remarriage. Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting to both Catherine and Anne, became a serious contender for the king's affections. As political and religious tensions mounted, Anne's position became increasingly precarious. The failure of her third pregnancy and the growing popularity of Jane Seymour set the stage for the Boleyns' fall. The king, influenced by both personal and political factors, decided to take action, leading to the arrests and executions of Anne and George Boleyn. January was a month of tragedy and tension. On the 7th, Catherine of Aragon passed away, and just weeks later, on the 24th, King Henry VIII suffered a severe fall from his horse during a jousting tournament at Greenwich. The accident left him unconscious for 2 hours, causing great panic among his courtiers. 5 days later, Queen Anne Boleyn miscarried a child that was about 3.5 months old. Anne claimed the miscarriage was due to her anxiety over Henry's accident, but some suspected her pregnancy had been troubled from the start. Despite skepticism from some contemporaries, including the Emperor Charles V, the evidence from Anne's attendants and other sources confirmed the miscarriage. The news of the miscarriage devastated Henry. He blamed his lack of a son on God's disapproval, showing little concern for Anne's distress. This reaction raised questions about the future of their marriage. Some speculated that a deformed fetus, though unsupported by evidence, might have been the reason for Henry's growing dissatisfaction. Such a deformity, according to contemporary beliefs, could suggest Anne's infidelity, a charge that would later be used against her. As February turned to March, Henry's mood remained volatile. He quarreled with Anne frequently, and their usual passionate reconciliations did not follow. This shift in their relationship coincided with the political maneuverings of Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister. Cromwell, who had never favored the pro-French policies that Anne supported, saw an opportunity to mend ties with the emperor. Charles, keen to detach Henry from France, was willing to negotiate, even recognizing Anne as queen to achieve his goals. However, Anne opposed any deal that would harm her daughter Elizabeth's claim to the throne, complicating Cromwell's plans. Anne's political influence extended beyond her stance on Mary. She also opposed Henry's plan to dissolve the smaller monasteries, arguing that the revenues should be used for religious purposes. This public opposition to a bill supported by Cromwell and the king further strained her position. By April, Cromwell had shifted his allegiance from Anne to Jane Seymour, a more compliant and less controversial candidate for queen. This move required Cromwell to ally with the conservative elements at court, who supported Jane and opposed Anne. Removing Anne would not be easy. A capital charge was necessary, and Cromwell had to convince Henry that Anne had committed adultery and plotted against him. On April 24th, a commission for the trial of high treason was issued, and on the 27th, writs were sent out for a new parliament. These actions, while routine, suggested Cromwell was preparing a case against Anne. However, as late as April 28th, Henry's letter to his ambassador in Rome indicated no immediate dissatisfaction with Anne. It seemed that her survival and even her triumph were still possible. But between April 28th and 30th, Henry's attitude changed dramatically. According to Lancelot de Carles, a secretary to the French ambassador, a lady of Anne's privy chamber, identified as Elizabeth, Countess of Worcester, was pregnant and accused Anne of adultery. Cromwell, upon learning of Mark Smeaton's confession to having sexual relations with Anne, presented this to Henry. Henry, already suspicious, became convinced of Anne's guilt when he heard about a conversation between Anne and Henry Norris, where Anne had jokingly suggested Norris would take her place if the king died. Henry postponed a trip to Calais and allowed a tournament to proceed on May 1st, during which he suddenly left. Norris, who had been with Henry, was later arrested for denying his involvement. Anne and her brother George were also taken into custody. Over the next few days, Cromwell built a case against Anne and her alleged lovers, securing their arrests and building a narrative of treason and adultery. On May 9th, juries were impaneled, and the trials of Anne's accused accomplices began. Despite their denials, all were found guilty and condemned to death. Anne's trial followed, and she too was found guilty and sentenced to death. The events of May 1536 marked the end of Anne's reign and the beginning of a new chapter in Henry's life, with Jane Seymour soon to become his new queen. Anne Boleyn's final days were filled with a mix of despair and defiance. She was taken to the Tower of London with a few attendants, and her behavior during this time was erratic, suggesting a deep sense of fear and hysteria. Despite denying the charges against her, she recalled flirtatious conversations that only heightened the suspicions against her. Flirting was second nature to Anne, and she had engaged in such behavior with several men, including Norris and Smeaton. She also made jokes at King Henry VIII's expense, questioning his virility, which only worsened her situation as the king was notoriously sensitive about this. On May 15th, Anne and her brother George were tried separately. Despite a composed and intelligent defense, both were found guilty. The Lord Marshal, the Duke of Norfolk, was Anne's uncle, yet he was still willing to carry out the trial, showing how alienated he had become from her. Anne's father, the Earl of Wiltshire, wanted to serve on the court but was excluded, possibly to avoid a conflict of interest or to spare him the pain. The charges against George were primarily based on his close relationship with Anne and the regular access he had to her. He was accused of specific offenses, including the particularly heinous crime of incest, which was detested by both the law and the king. Anne was also accused of conspiring to poison Mary and Henry Fitzroy, though the evidence for this was weak and seemed to stem from the king's personal beliefs. When the news of Anne's condemnation reached Henry, his primary concern was how he had been betrayed by her. The conservative faction at court celebrated, but Thomas Cromwell, understanding the king's volatile nature, knew he couldn't relax until Anne was dead. He encouraged Henry to believe that Anne had had numerous lovers, a claim that even the Spanish ambassador Chapais found strange. For the first time, Anne found some public sympathy, and Archbishop Cranmer made a half-hearted attempt to intercede on her behalf. Though Cromwell blocked this, the Boleyn faction was systematically dismantled. Sir Thomas Wyatt was imprisoned but not charged, and other associates like George Taylor were relieved when the investigations ended. The Earl of Wiltshire escaped suspicion by distancing himself from Anne's religious views. Anne spent her last days in the Tower, alternating between tearful despair and religious devotion. She clung to the hope of being sent to a nunnery, but also discussed her execution with the Lieutenant of the Tower, Sir William Kingston. On May 17th, Archbishop Cranmer dissolved Anne's marriage to Henry, declaring it null. This was necessary to make their daughter, Elizabeth, illegitimate. George was executed the same day, making a speech where he admitted to being a poor follower of the scriptures, but did not confess to the charges against him. On May 19th, Anne was executed. The Calais executioner, known for using a sword rather than an axe, was brought in for the task. Anne's final words were composed and dignified. She asked for God's mercy, praised the king, and asked the people to pray for her. Her body was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. With Anne's death, Henry was free to marry again. He quickly wed Jane Seymour on May 30th. This new marriage brought hope of improved relations with the Holy See, and the possibility of a Portuguese bride for Henry. However, the person who benefited the most from Anne's fall was Thomas Cromwell. He now had no rivals for the king's favor, while the Seymours, though influential, lacked the political agenda of the Boleyns. Anne's guilt remains a subject of debate. Some historians, like Professor Ives, argue that the evidence against her was weak and circumstantial. Others, like Professor Bernard, suggest that her flirtatious nature may have led to genuine sexual misconduct. The charge of incest against George is widely considered politically motivated, and his defense was strong enough to have earned him an acquittal in a fairer court. The fall of the Boleyns was a relief for Princess Mary's supporters, who saw it as a step toward restoring Mary's legitimacy. However, Henry's commitment to his role as supreme head of the church meant that Mary would have to accept his ecclesiastical authority and her own illegitimate status to be reconciled with him. Despite this, Mary wrote to Cromwell and her father, offering to be obedient but reserving her conscience. When she was asked to repudiate the Pope and accept the nullity of her mother's marriage, she refused, leading to a tense moment where she was technically guilty of treason. The court was in a state of high alert, and several of Mary's supporters were arrested for discussing her status. Henry Carey, Anne Boleyn's nephew, was treated as part of the royal family from a young age. Born in 1526, he lost his father when he was 2 and was raised by his mother, Mary Boleyn, who remarried in 1534. This marriage caused her to be somewhat isolated from court, but she was partly rehabilitated after Anne's fall. Henry's wardship was granted to her, and when she died in 1543, his care reverted to the crown. He joined the royal household in 1545 when he was 19 and married Anne Morgan, a well-connected lady from Herefordshire, the same year. Their marriage was a long and happy one, producing 6 children with their first, George, born in 1546 or 1547. Henry's military career began in 1545 when he served under John Dudley, Viscount Lisle, in the defense of Portsmouth. Though no action was taken, he impressed Lisle, who chose him to accompany the peace negotiations with France in 1546. By the time King Henry VIII died in 1547, Henry was well established in royal service. Henry inherited the town of Buckingham and the manor of Rochford in Essex upon reaching adulthood. He represented Buckingham in Parliament in 1547 and received his lands in 1548. He and his family often resided at Rochford when not at court. During Edward VI's reign, Henry was seen as a useful but secondary player. He continued to serve under the Earl of Warwick and was sent to France again in 1551. In 1552, Henry sold his rights in Buckingham to Robert Brown, likely due to financial difficulties. He did not represent Buckingham in the parliaments of 1553, but returned to his seat in 1554 and 1555. His opposition to the Exiles Bill in 1555 earned him disfavor with the government, and he was briefly imprisoned for debt in 1557. Despite these setbacks, he maintained a minor position at court as a carver in the chamber, and served as a gentleman of the household to Princess Elizabeth, likely due to his kinship with her. Throughout Mary I's reign, Henry's Protestant sympathies were known, but he managed to remain in court, a testament to the complex political landscape of the time. His role with Princess Elizabeth, though not lucrative, was significant, and it would serve him well in the future. By the end of Mary's reign, Henry was a seasoned courtier, navigating the treacherous waters of Tudor politics with a mix of loyalty and pragmatism. His relationship with Elizabeth, who would become queen in 1558, would prove to be a crucial asset in the years to come. Henry's life story is a testament to the resilience and strategic thinking required to survive and thrive in the tumultuous world of the Tudor court.